3 creepy babysitting horror stories. During my college years, I earned additional cash by babysitting without being required to adhere to a set work schedule. I typically watched over this family's 4-year-old son for 2 to 3 times per week due to the parents' frequent business dinners. Although the child was quiet, I found that to be an asset as it made him effortless to supervise. He merely viewed television and played with objects, but he appeared to like me. It had been 6 times since I had begun keeping an eye on him. I arrived at the residence shortly before his parents departed. They informed me that they would be returning at approximately 11 p.m. tonight, and it was my responsibility to ensure he was in bed by 9 o'clock. Initially, everything transpired as usual. As we watched television together, I prepared a frozen pizza for him. He informed me that he needed to use the restroom after completing his meal and then departed for a few minutes. Upon his return, he inquired concerning the rustling sounds emanating from the basement. I turned off the television immediately out of confusion. Undoubtedly, as soon as the television fell silent, I could hear something moving around downstairs. It was, however, extremely dim, and I was unable to discern its nature. Upon observing the boy's obvious fear, I reassured him that everything would be fine and that it was likely a small animal that had entered. I instructed him to wait while I descend to determine what the matter was. The process of rearranging had ceased by this juncture. I had never entered this house's unfinished cellar before, and there had never been a reason to do so. Therefore, I was extremely cautious. After opening the door, I activated the light adjacent to the stairwell. I then descended the stairs in silence and activated the light at the very bottom, thereby illuminating the entire chamber. The room was sizable and was occupied primarily with storage containers. As I strolled around, I peered behind a few boxes, but returned upstairs when I did not observe or hear anything else. I was awaited by the boy on the settee, and upon seeing me, he leapt to his feet. To make him feel better, I reassured him that everything was fine and that nothing was lower there, and then I gave him a big embrace. We quickly forgot about the incident after a few moments. A couple of hours later, as 9 o'clock approached, I commenced the process of preparing him for bed. Following that, we descended to his chamber, where I inspected his readiness before bidding him farewell and returning downstairs. I sat on the couch for approximately 30 to 40 minutes, scrolling through my phone, when I once more heard much louder shuffling emanating from the cellar. Momentarily, my heart halted as I listened. I then heard the door to my upstairs bedroom open, followed by the lad calling my name. I instructed him to remain in his current location and abstain from descending. As soon as I stood, I proceeded to the subterranean entrance. At this juncture, I was quite frightened. I prepared my phone to dial 911 as I opened the door in the quietest manner possible. It appeared from the shuffling that they were approaching the bottom of the stairs. I approached and activated the illumination. Without delay, I bolted the door shut and rushed upstairs to retrieve the youngster before exiting the premises and dialing 911. As I awaited the arrival of the police, I observed the house's windows from a distance, across the street. Additionally, I contacted the parents to apprise them of the situation and request their prompt return home. When the police arrived at last, I described the situation to them. As I turned on the lights by the stairs, I noticed a man crouched and rummaging through a storage box while half naked. A thorough search of the residence yielded unmistakable indications that someone had recently occupied the basement, including trash heaps stuffed into boxes, but no one was discovered. When the parents arrived, they expressed gratitude for my phone call and proceeded to discuss the situation with the police. I was able to return home approximately 1 hour later, during which time they had secured the residence and filed the reports. The subsequent few days were spent feeling extremely agitated and paranoid. I maintained communication with the parents for a few weeks in an attempt to obtain any updates regarding the individual, but to no avail. We eventually lost contact because I was no longer interested in babysitting. The most horrifying aspect of the situation, in my opinion, was that he evaded apprehension and might even be residing in the basement of another individual at this very moment. At the request of my closest friend, I would intermittently provide babysitting services for their 7-year-old daughter, Sarah. They resided in a magnificent Washington residence that was surrounded by mountains and forests. The distance between me and the nearest neighbors was a few miles, so I always appreciated the tranquility during my stays. In any case, my friend requested that I monitor Sarah for 2 days prior to her business trip. I consented, and I arrived at her residence a few weeks later. Following a brief exchange of thoughts and a shared lunch, she completed her packing and departed in preparation for her flight. I spent several hours with Sarah, during which time I listened to her discuss school and her peers. Following that, I accompanied her on a dinner and dessert excursion. When we returned home at 8 o'clock at night, we agreed to watch a movie before bed. As I began to locate a movie while seated on the couch and scrolling through a list, Sarah asked, "Who's that?" I looked in the direction she was indicating the front door and then heard someone knocking. Given the house's extreme isolation, I never anticipated that anyone would approach the door. I walked over and nervously cracked the door open. A tall individual was positioned atop the veranda. His expression of bewilderment changed slightly as I opened the door. "May I assist you?" I inquired. Looking through the gap in the door while leaning to the left, he responded, "I apologize. I was just confirming that someone was home." He then turned away and began to walk. Undoubtedly, I found this to be quite peculiar and even slightly unsettling. After securely closing and locking the front door, I proceeded to lock the rear door as well. When Sarah inquired as to who it was, I responded that it was merely a neighbor before returning to the settee to begin watching a movie. Both of us appreciated the film, although it ran for a bit longer than I had anticipated. I accompanied Sarah upstairs as she prepared for bed after informing her that it was time for bed. After she was in bed, I descended once more and reclined on the couch. I reasoned that since it was just after 10 and I wasn't overly exhausted, I would simply turn on something on the television and unwind for a while before retiring to bed. As I continued to watch television, I began to hear a grinding sound emanating from somewhere. While muting the program, I paid closer attention. It emanated from the rear of the residence. As I walked to the back door and activated the back porch light, I surveyed my surroundings. The only object visible to me was an empty porch surrounded by trees in the distance. I remained there and listened for an additional few minutes before returning to the settee. I pondered whether my apprehension stemmed from my state of mind or from the darkness and isolation within a home that was surrounded by a forest. During the day, I always felt secure and even enjoyed myself. But as soon as the sun set, I would begin to feel a little uneasy. In any case, I increased the volume once more and chose to lie down in an effort to fall asleep more quickly. It had apparently been too effective, as I promptly dropped asleep on the couch. I awoke a few hours later to find the television still on. I turned it off and sat up, fatiguedly wiping my eyes. However, I began to feel uneasy once more when I observed how silent the home had become. Nothing at all could be heard. I subsequently started to hear the identical crunching sound, but this time it sounded like footfall. It emanated from the room adjacent to mine on the right side of the residence. They halted a few seconds later, presumably directly in front of one of the windows with the curtains drawn. With profound dread, I approached the window in a measured and subdued manner, retracting the curtain. There was no presence. I surveyed my surroundings but failed to observe any objects. I reasoned that I must have been overly exhausted and had been hallucinating it, so I went upstairs to get a glass of water before retiring to bed. The following morning, after I had prepared brunch for us, we gathered for a discussion regarding our intentions for the day. Sarah inquired as we were discussing plans as to why I was circling outside the previous evening. After a moment of pause, I inquired as to what she had observed. She reported hearing someone wander the home for nearly an hour after she had already retired for the night. As cold sweats descended my body, I instructed her to remain indoors while I surveyed the exterior. Just in case, I retrieved a small knife and exited the home via the front door while circumnavigating it. Although it was difficult to determine whether the walls near certain windows and entrances bore marks from the previous evening or if I had already visited, I did observe some scratches. Aside from that, however, everything appeared normal. It was difficult to discern whether or not footprints were present in the yard due to the predominance of dense vegetation. As I returned to the front door, I noticed the man who had been there the day before strolling along the street in front of the residence. Again, he was merely passing through, but this home was quite isolated from everything else, so he must have traveled at least 2 miles on foot to get there. I returned inside and informed Sarah that we were planning to visit the mall for the day for a stroll. I desperately needed to be away from home as soon as possible, so I intended to spend as much time as possible away. We were away for some time and did not return home until 6 o'clock at night. Soon after, a friend called me to inquire about our well-being. She confirmed her recognition of the peculiar individual I had described his features and stated that she had observed him a few weeks prior. Evidently, he approached her residence and requested to spend the night, but she unequivocally declined. We both agreed that I would contact the police immediately and not take any chances if anything else occurred. As the sun began to set, I performed a final inspection of each door to ensure that it remained securely locked. Sarah and I were playing a quick board game before bed at approximately 9 p.m. when we both began to hear a gentle tapping sound emanating from one of the windows. I carefully stood up and advised Sarah to maintain her composure when I heard Sarah's room adjacent to the window of the house, emanating a loud scratching sound from outside the walls. Sarah was in my grasp as I dashed into the garage. We entered the vehicle, and I hurriedly reversed out of the driveway, ensuring that the garage was completely closed prior to departing. As we were departing, the darkness obscured my vision, but Sarah reported seeing an individual sprinting into the trees behind the residence. After pulling into a hotel parking lot and reporting the incident to the police, I proceeded to inform my friend of the situation via phone call. 10 minutes later, 2 officers from the hotel awaited our arrival and informed us that 2 more were conducting surveillance at the residence. I provided them with a comprehensive account and an account of the man himself. Ultimately, they departed. We ultimately retired to a hotel room for the evening. My acquaintance called the following morning to report that her flight had just landed and that she would be returning in an hour. Consequently, we proceeded to her residence. After waiting for her to arrive in the driveway, we all entered the building together to ensure our safety. After dropping by for a few hours to simply discuss various topics, I bid farewell and returned home. It was without a doubt one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. But thankfully, the man was apprehended a month later, after being reported by numerous individuals for attempting to breach into their residences. The most terrifying aspect of the individual in question was the fact that he never provided an explanation for his behavior. Although it appeared that he had broken into one of the residences, he did not pilfer anything. He merely took a brief glance around before departing empty-handed. It never ceases to amaze me as to what exactly he was attempting to accomplish the evening he made the attempt to breach the door. Once per week, beginning when I was 13 years old, I had a caregiver because my mother worked late every Saturday night. I have always believed that I was too elderly to continue having a babysitter and abhorred being constantly monitored. Thomas, age 20, was the primary guest at my mother's house. Thomas was the progeny of one of my mother's professional acquaintances. This individual was extremely peculiar, and I had no affinity for him. He hardly spoke and simply exhibited extremely uncomfortable and peculiar behavior. However, except when he was with my mother, he would become exceptionally cordial and talkative. When I would bring it up with her, she would invariably respond that all I wanted was to get rid of him in order to be alone. In any case, it was an ordinary Saturday evening, and Thomas, as usual, had just arrived a little late. After having a brief conversation with him, my mother prepared to go to work. To cause harm time, I crossed over to the settee and activated my Xbox in order to play some video games. As my customary bedtime was 10, my time with Thomas would be limited to 4 to 5 hours. Today was no different from the majority of the time, when I would find something to do by myself, since he rarely spoke to me and would simply hang out in the kitchen or our mezzanine. A few minutes after he had remained in the kitchen for a short while, I overheard him conversing with someone. I made every effort to pay attention, but I was unable to discern what he was saying. Although I was in the living room and directly across from the kitchen, he was speaking very gently. He continued speaking for a few minutes before ceasing and subsequently entering the living room to position himself next to the settee. I noticed he was holding his phone when I glanced up at him. Thomas advised that there was no need for concern as someone was approaching momentarily. It was difficult to determine how to respond, so I simply replied, "Okay." However, it was quite peculiar, and while I was certain that no caregiver should have done it, I also understood that there was little I could do about it. The subsequent 20 minutes were extremely awkward because he remained motionless on the settee with me, gazing around without picking up his phone or doing anything else. It was highly unusual for him to be present in the same room as me, so this occurrence was quite peculiar. Nevertheless, our living room was in close proximity to the front entrance, so he was likely merely awaiting the arrival of the individual. Eventually, a man knocked on the door after a vehicle drove into the driveway. Thomas arose and walked to the door, where he briefly stood in front of it, before turning to me and confirming that he would be back in 1 minute. After that, he exited the room and exited the door while closing it behind him. His whereabouts piqued my curiosity throughout the entirety of this circumstance. Just enough cracking in the window coverings allowed me to discern the shadows cast by both individuals as they navigated the driveway. It was evident that the individual presented Thomas with a sizable bag before boarding his vehicle and departing. A few seconds later, I heard Thomas return through the front door after the lid of the trash can outside had been firmly sealed. The entire exchange appeared peculiar, and I found it impossible not to inquire as to its subject matter. Thomas responded that it was merely a friend's pocketbook and that he had forgotten it at the friend's residence the night before. Thus he was simply returning it. I could tell there was a problem with his response because it failed to account for the substantial luggage that I observed him carrying. However, I refrained from further questioning him and simply responded, "Okay," before returning to my game. However, the night became considerably more peculiar as it unfolded. Throughout the subsequent hour, Thomas engaged in numerous phone conversations with an individual in the kitchen. At one juncture, he proceeded to the distant attic area where his voice could be overheard. However, I still was unable to comprehend what he was saying. Thomas ran outside silently upon hearing the same vehicle pull into the driveway a second time, approximately 5 or 6 calls in total. It was evident from their movement and body language that they were engaged in a dispute regarding some matter. Following a 30-second absence, Thomas returned carrying the satchel from earlier. The man quickly loaded the item into his rear seat before driving away. Upon Thomas's return inside, his expression of frustration was evident to me. He returned from the kitchen at 10 p.m., at which point he instructed me on how to retire for the night. I dressed and retired to bed while Thomas remained downstairs. Typically, he would remain until my mother returned home at 12 p.m. However, I heard the front door open and close within minutes. After 10 minutes of waiting, I rose and descended the stairs to determine whether he had left. However, he had indeed departed. Upon glancing out the window, I noticed that his vehicle had also departed. After several hours of waiting in bed for my mother to return home, I proceeded to detail the events that had transpired to her. This time, she appeared to take my word for it, as she too found it odd and extremely unprofessional to abandon the house prior to her return. She attempted to call him the following day, but he did not respond. Eventually, however, she contacted her acquaintance who was Thomas's mother and inquired as to what had transpired. She responded that Thomas had returned home feeling ill. It was apparent to both of us that his statement was untruthful and illogical, given that he could have simply called her to inform her of his illness. In any case, nearly a decade has passed since everything that transpired, and I still find myself reflecting on how peculiar that evening was. I am perpetually perplexed as to the subject of their dispute, the motive behind his departure, and the contents of the luggage. 3 disturbing food delivery at night horror stories. Due to academic obligations, I frequently worked as a pizza delivery driver during my senior year of high school. I had always worked the Friday and Saturday night rounds. The majority of the time, I would be driving or standing in the shop receiving phone orders. It was a relatively unstructured position. Additionally, a few of my acquaintances were employed there, which ensured that I consistently had company for conversation. Regardless, it was Friday evening and I had just returned from my final break. Since the establishment closes at 1 a.m., we typically cease accepting orders around 12 a.m. in order to complete the cleaning and packing before departing. Despite the time being 11:30, I resolved to spare the time by commencing the cleaning in advance. That evening, only myself and 2 other companions were employed. One was just finishing up a delivery, and the other 2 simply went on break after I returned from work. The phone began to ring a few minutes into my tidying, so I answered it and inquired as to how I could be of assistance. A senior citizen on the line inquired whether our establishment was still available to accept deliveries. I replied affirmatively, but large reservations are not being accepted at this time. They responded that was acceptable, requested a standard pizza, and provided the delivery address. After approximately 15 minutes, the pizza was done, and I packed it and returned to my vehicle. I was approximately halfway to the destination, which was slightly over 10 minutes away, when I collided with a vehicle that was stationary at a stop sign on an unoccupied road. I gazed around for a few seconds while waiting to determine the reason for his lengthy halt. I then softly honked my horn, presuming he had fallen unconscious or something. As the automobile remained stationary, I initiated the process of approaching from behind him. However, precisely at that moment that I did so, he applied the accelerator and accelerated down the road. I was mildly irritated, but I assumed it was merely a nutjob acting frivolously, so I proceeded further along the road. However, I passed that same vehicle a few minutes later, as it was stopped on the side of the road with its headlights off. Passing them gave me a terrible sense of unease, as if something were amiss with the situation. The remainder of the way to the house, I scrutinized my reflections to ensure that he was not attempting to pursue me. I ultimately descended the lengthy driveway leading to the residence, which traversed a dense woodland. Approaching the front of the residence, I positioned the vehicle in park. Once I had confirmed that I had everything, I approached the door and began to knock. 2 minutes later, an elderly woman responded and inquired as to what I was up to. I informed her that I would be delivering the pizza to the specified address and proceeded to recite it to her. Upon hearing that no one in the room had placed an order for pizza, it was clear that she felt sorry for my situation. She was simply thanked, and I returned to my vehicle. This occurrence was not exceptional. Certain individuals would engage in it unintentionally as a hoax or provide the incorrect address by mistake. I reasoned that after exiting the woman's driveway, I would contact my acquaintance to request that they confirm the address via phone call. Consequently, I commenced my ascent from the driveway. However, as I descended, the intense headlights obscured my vision of the road ahead. It was so dazzling that I immediately applied the brakes, certain that an approaching vehicle was the cause. I awaited the vehicle until it either turned off its lights or reverse. But after a short while of waiting, I concluded that they were not going to move. I had no idea what to do because my vision was hazy, and I was aware that the driveway was narrow, rendering it impossible to navigate around them. Given the lack of viable alternatives, I made the decision to observe their initial action. We both remained motionless for an entire minute before they turned out the lights entirely. I looked in that direction to see where their vehicle was after allowing my eyes to recalibrate to the darkness, but I was unable to make it out. Putting the vehicle back in drive, I made my way down the driveway gradually, exercising caution in case the other vehicle resumed its descent. A few seconds later, I noticed the vehicle parked in the middle of the path with no headlights on. I was able to identify it as the vehicle that had been located at the stop sign. It appears that he followed me in my absence. Due to the lack of visibility through the windows caused by the darkness, I became increasingly anxious and concerned as I sat there, apprehensive that there might be several individuals inside with malicious intentions. Then, upon the front driver door opening, a male exited the vehicle and started to approach me. He stopped halfway to my vehicle and started waving at me, as if to request that I drive up next to him. I would be committing an outright admission of my increasing anxiety at this juncture. Despite my best efforts to maintain composure, I rolled the car next to him, which was the prize. He did not speak to me when I drew up. He did not even turn to face me. He then began to walk around my vehicle before stopping directly behind me by the trunk. As I regarded my rearview mirror, I endeavored to discern his whereabouts and determine why he was remaining stationary. I have been observing this individual for a few moments when I have an abrupt realization and turn my head to face the front. The remaining 3 car doors open and 3 additional men begin to dash towards my vehicle. As soon as my adrenaline began to surge, I floored the gas and nearly collided with one of the men as I reversed my vehicle out of the driveway. I nearly collided with multiple trees as I swerved to avoid colliding with their vehicle before regaining the path and ultimately emerging onto the main road. At this moment, there was no one else on the road, so I could see every detail in my rearview mirror as the vehicle emerged onto the road and began approaching me. I assumed they wouldn't stop until I could find a less isolated location, but the men turned down a side road after 30 seconds. I returned to work and informed my colleagues about the incident without delay. They both persuaded me to report the incident to the police by calling them, despite the fact that I was unable to provide much assistance. After I provided an official statement regarding the incident and an officer descended, they departed. The day after we had closed, I was taken aback when I received a phone call informing me that 3 of the men involved in the robbery, attempt that occurred in the driveway where I was standing that evening, had been apprehended. The men were apprehended when the woman alerted the police in response to 2 additional individuals attempting to deliver her unordered food. It appeared that they were attempting to entice delivery vehicles in order to rob them on their way out, given that the driveway was narrow, isolated, and surrounded by trees. Nonetheless, the fourth individual managed to escape by squeezing through the trees, and I received no further information regarding his whereabouts in the days that followed, so it is uncertain whether he was ever located. However, the elderly woman stated that she was not informed and had not observed them in the driveway prior to that evening. Although the fact that this occurred to me is quite peculiar, I am also pleased with my prompt reaction time and the fact that I managed to escape unscathed. Despite the fact that it undoubtedly increased the stress level of my job, I was able to modify my schedules to exclusively daytime work on the weekends shortly thereafter. I truly hope that last individual was apprehended, however, because his escape could have put a countless number of people in those horrifying situations. During my freshman year of college, I was employed as a food delivery driver. I would drive primarily for DoorDash or Uber Eats. As I disliked conversing with strangers and didn't want random individuals in my car, I opted to deliver food instead of driving for Uber. I oversaw this for more than a year with minimal complications, with the exception of the sporadic customer who was irate that the establishment made a mistake with their order. In any case, it was late on a Wednesday night and I had no classes the following morning, so I decided to deliver for a small fee in order to earn a few additional dollars. After completing 4 or 5 fast orders, I was back in my dorm room within 20 minutes. As it was approaching 1 a.m., I reasoned that I should probably conclude it there and return home. The operation of the delivery applications essentially entails driving around and waiting for a random order to appear. The app will then provide an estimate of the distance and amount of money you'll be required to travel. You are then required to approve or decline it. I left the application operating on my way back in the event that an incredibly urgent delivery was nearby. I received a few requests, but they seemed excessively distant and unworthy of my time. However, as I was heading into my dorm, another one materialized. Although situated at a distance of 12 miles, the compensation was enormous. Before, I had never witnessed anyone offer that much money. It was quite distant, so I gave it some thought, but the price was simply too good to pass up. I started navigating in the direction of the restaurant after accepting the offer. A few moments later, however, I arrived and retrieved their order in order to verify that I had purchased the correct items. Upon entering the establishment, I observed that the patron had placed an order for a mere 2 items with a cumulative bill of less than $6. This occurrence was highly atypical, given that high-paying orders are typically the result of substantial shipments of high-priced food. This essentially meant that they were leaving me a colossal tip. I returned to my vehicle after obtaining the sustenance. As I drove there, all I could think about was how they could have given such a large tip for such a modest order. It was a little peculiar, but in all honesty, I concluded that it was either an oversight or an attempt at benevolence on their part. Despite the fact that 12 miles did not seem particularly far from my campus, I had yet to visit this region, with primarily gated-off neighborhood communities and enormous homes. It was quite lovely. Fortunately, their residents lacked a gate, allowing me to simply drive into the neighborhood. As I passed by the residences, I realized that the tip money had become much clearer. Despite the street's length, I was within a few minutes of approaching the residence when the client transmitted a text message via the application. They instructed me to ensure that the food was delivered to the correct address. As I approached, I assumed the map might have indicated his neighbor's residence or something. Therefore, upon my arrival, I texted him a detailed description of the property and inquired whether or not that was the correct one. He responded in the negative, and I waited a moment, anticipating that he would elaborate on his residence, but he never did. However, he blocked me after I sent him another text message describing his neighbor's residence. As I grew increasingly irritated with this individual, I attempted to call him but received no answer. After a few rings, he would decline the incoming call. After re-examining the address, I proceeded to enter it into Google in an attempt to locate it. As I was performing this action, I observed that the address number was not a typical one. It was adorned with a subset of numerals. I was uncertain of its meaning and had never encountered this before. Thus, I conducted a Google search for the address and examined the results. I discovered, upon closer inspection of the map, that the address in fact indicated a location precisely between the 2 residences. Upon closer inspection, it appeared that there was a minuscule garage or possibly a barn. It could hardly be seen. As I averted my gaze from the smartphone and surveyed the area between the two residences, I noticed a diminutive structure resembling a garage. A few feet separated it from the primary residence that my delivery application directed me to. Honestly, I had no idea what to expect or why anyone would even choose to reside there. But I had already traveled this far, so I had no intention of leaving at this time. So I exited the building and began to make my way there. As I ascended the driveway, the location became readily apparent. Essentially, it was a sizable storage garage, most likely intended for storing an obsolete automobile or something. However, I failed to observe a typical entrance, so I positioned the bag in front of the garage door. As I started to remove my phone in order to capture an image for the application, an individual approached from the right side of the garage. As I turned to face him, he was standing motionless and gazing at me. I carefully began to walk away after stating, "It's right here for you, sir," while pointing to the bag because the individual was extremely unsettling. He then responded that this was not the location where he wanted me to leave it. Upon turning around, I observed that he had not moved from where he had been standing. "Alas, where exactly did you want me to place it?" I said, as I began to feel extremely uneasy about the situation. He indicated the door by circling the rear of the garage and declared it to be there. There was no way I could have followed that individual to whatever he was attempting to convince me to do at that moment. After barely standing there for a moment, I apologized and returned to my vehicle in a hurry. As I reassessed the situation from my vehicle, I noticed that the man was returning behind the garage while neglecting to return the container of food. I drove the entire distance back to my lodgings while trembling after leaving that location. I felt extremely uneasy about the situation, and the fact that it was situated in a particularly pleasant neighborhood only added to my perplexity. As I elaborated, however, I came to the realization of how peculiar it was that he insisted I deliver the food to the garage and would not accept it unless I accompanied him to the main residence. Never in my entire life had I been required to call the police, and I ultimately refrained from doing so this time around, uncertain as to whether or not he was merely a peculiar, innocuous individual. Regardless, it caused me some distress for a few days, but I overcame it in the end and continued making deliveries during my free time. However, nothing further transpired. A few weeks later, another sizable order appeared in my app with the same delivery area. Clearly, I declined, but I couldn't help but consider the circumstances surrounding the delivery of the order to whoever ultimately accepted it. I began the autumn season by working as a cashier at a small store in close proximity to my apartment. After my regular workday concluded at 9:20 p.m., I would typically spend a couple of hours completing food deliveries before returning home. Deliveries at night were my favorite because the roadways were less congested, and the majority of other delivery drivers were at work during the day when they would take all the orders. Consequently, I would receive more orders to complete at night. In any case, I had just finished work and was setting up my app in preparation for making some deliveries. The initial one that was received was completed in approximately 15 minutes. I then awaited the arrival of the subsequent order for a few moments. The payout was satisfactory, and the delivery location was 20 minutes distant from my current location. After obtaining their food from the fast food establishment, I commenced my descent towards the residence. My municipality is relatively small and contains numerous vacant parcels of land. The majority of restaurants in the town center, where my accommodation is located, are situated in that area. Then, approximately 10 minutes away, the dwellings become considerably more dispersed and are surrounded by farmland. While the majority of the deliveries I receive occur within the town vicinity, I do receive the occasional package that travels further into the rural area. I anticipated that this would be a farmhouse based on the fact that it was 20 minutes distant. The application, on the other hand, indicated that the address was situated in a residential area adjacent to a minor thoroughfare. It simply terrified me to make nighttime deliveries to isolated farmhouses, so I was relieved to be making a delivery to a neighborhood residence. Upon disengaging from the highway, I proceeded in a leftward direction along the road towards the neighborhood. However, I received an immediate phone call from an unknown number. I declined the call because I suspected it was a scam, but they phoned back a few seconds later. Assuming it was the client, I reluctantly consented to it. "Good day?" I inquired. Without receiving a response after a few seconds, I simply hung up. However, the exact same number called me within a few moments later. I responded. and a man informed me almost immediately that I had made a mistake by turning in the incorrect direction. As I was following the directions on the map, I inquired as to his clarification. He stated that his address is frequently misrepresented on the delivery app, requiring him to contact the drivers each time to provide them with the correct location. I consented and inquired as to how he could reach the location. After exiting the highway, he instructed me to turn right onto that road and then make a third left. He stated that a gravel path ultimately led to his farmhouse. After indicating my arrival time in a few minutes, I reversed the vehicle. It was fairly common out here for customers to call me, informing me that the address was off, or to provide directions on unnamed roadways, so I honestly didn't give it much thought. After passing the highway onto which I had deviated, I proceeded until I reached the third left turn and alighted onto the gravel path. The pathway led into a dimly lit forest comprised of trees. Once more, these areas did not sit well with me at night, so I was undeniably apprehensive as I traversed this secluded gravel road. As soon as I began to feel uneasy, I began to wonder how peculiar it was that the map had led me so far in the opposite direction of the man's purported residence. I attempted to suppress those thoughts by assuring myself that my nervousness was the cause of my overthinking. But after a few moments had passed, the house remained out of sight. Even though I was uncertain whether I had taken the correct turn, the trees were too near to the sides to allow for a significant turnaround. I reasoned that I would proceed until the end, at which point I would call to inquire whether I had arrived at the correct location, and if not, I would turn around. 2 more minutes passed before I eventually arrived at the terminus, where the road turned into a narrow circular driveway adjacent to a residence. I approached the entrance via the pathway and positioned my vehicle in close proximity to a commercial advertisement affixed to the front facade of the residence. Seeing this, I was uncertain whether I was looking at the correct residence. However, upon examining the front door, I noticed that it was ajar, and an individual further back was waving to me. Assuming I was in excellent health, I retrieved the bag and began to make my way to the door. As I descended the porch and commenced setting the bag down, I beheld the man once more traversing the corridor that terminated at the kitchen. He asked me if I could place the food on the kitchen counter, then hurriedly departed as if he were in a hurry. I then overheard him turn on the kitchen faucet. I entered the residence with reluctance and peered around. Despite being adorned with vintage furnishings and accessories, the space appeared nearly devoid of any utilization. Upon descending the hallway and entering the kitchen, I immediately observed that the sink continued to run while the man remained unseen. This caused cold sweats to stream down my face, and I hurriedly positioned the bag on the counter before evacuating the area. As I returned to my vehicle, I could hear the man yelling from the front door, but I was unable to decipher something he said. After putting the vehicle in motion, I returned in the same direction I had come from. I continued driving until I reached my apartment complex's parking lot. I then retrieved my phone and discovered that I had missed multiple calls from the same number. After blocking the number and resuming my nightly deliveries, I proceeded to access the delivery app. However, at that moment, I became cognizant of messages originating from the customer via the app, which apprised me of my erroneous turn and location at the incorrect residence. I was momentarily taken aback when I realized that the man who had contacted me was not my actual client and that the residence I was in belonged to an unknown individual. I promptly contacted the police and informed them of the situation. Soon after, an officer arrived at my apartment to discuss additional details. How this individual could have detected my location and understood that I was making a delivery was beyond my comprehension. According to the officer, my phone was most likely compromised, and the man was likely observing my every move. Upon hearing this, I felt extremely uneasy. The following day, to make matters worse, I was informed that the house I was viewing was in fact vacant, despite the fact that its proprietors had vacated months prior and had put it up for sale. Evidently, the individual gained access by means of an unlocked window situated in one of the chambers. At this time, nothing substantial has been discovered that could lead to the man's location, which makes me feel extremely unsafe. I do not know for certain what the man was attempting to accomplish, but it seems reasonable to assume that he intended to abduct me or something even more heinous. Although I make an effort to curb my thoughts, I cannot help but ruminate on the multitude of dreadful possibilities that could have transpired that evening.